Dear students, Clostridioides difficile. Clostridioides difficile was previously called as Clostridium difficile. It is usually described as an obligate anaerobe and a gram-positive spore-forming bacillus. Clostridioides difficile was previously called as Clostridium difficile. It was so named because it was usually difficult to isolate this bacillus. Taxonomically, however, it has recently been placed into a separate genus and therefore it is now Clostridioides difficile. This particular organism is usually associated with an entity called as antibiotic associated diarrhea. In this condition, the hallmark feature is pseudomembranous enteritis. This pseudomembranous colitis or antibiotic associated diarrhea usually occurs following prolonged antimicrobial use of cephalosporins, clindamycin, ampicillin, fluoroquinolones, including vancomycin and metronidazole, which is usually used to treat this condition. Along with prolonged antimicrobial use, sometimes prolonged hospital stay also enhances the chances of getting this infection. Therefore, usually Clostridioides difficile causes, in most of the cases, majority of the cases I should say, it causes hospital acquired infections. There are two toxins which are implicated in in this infection. You have toxin A and toxin B. Toxin A is called as enterotoxin and toxin B is a cytotoxin. Basically, both these toxins glycosylate the GTP binding proteins, causing a disruption of the cytoskeleton, leading to loss of cell shape, adherence, and also disruption of epithelial cell barrier. All these structural cytoskeletal changes lead to diarrhea and pseudomembrane formation. Please bear in mind that usually infants do not develop symptomatic infection because they lack the receptors for binding these toxins. The risk factors which predisposes the host to developing this infection is the suppression of normal flora due to the administration of antibiotics. Elderly individuals over 65 years of age, immunosuppressed malignancy cases, those who are on medications which suppress the gastric acid production like antacids, and the use of electronic rectal thermometer. Usually a ribotype B1 NAP1 O27 hypervirulent strain has been described to cause severe infection with production of higher levels of toxins. For this hypervirulent strain, we particularly use an antibiotic, a macrolide antibiotic called fidaxomicin. The clinical features of this particular organism is diarrhea followed by fever, abdominal pain, and leukocytosis. Pseudomembrane is nothing but necrotic leukocytes, fibrin, mucus, and cellular debris. This pseudomembrane attaches to the underlying mucosa, appearing as whitish yellow plaques of size between 1 to 2 millimeters, spreading over the entire colonic mucosa. Relapse is usually common in 15 to 30% of cases. Usually, this organism is identified based on stool cultures, cell culture cytotoxin neutralization assays, toxin detection, and colonoscopy along with histopathology. Molecular methods are also employed to detect this organism. So let us see all these lab diagnostic methods one by one. Stool culture is primarily done using special media like CCFA, which is cefoxitin cycloserine fructose agar, or CCYA, which is cefoxitin cycloserine egg yolk agar. Both these media are inoculated at 37 degrees for 24 to 48 hours for isolating the organism. However, mere isolation of the organism is not sufficient because toxin is the main factor for pathogenesis. Therefore, we need to demonstrate the toxins by performing other methods. Earlier, the toxin was detected in HEP2 or human diploid cultures by a neutralization assay. However, it is not as sensitive as stool culture and also has a longer turnaround time. Therefore, what we employ presently and most popularly is that we detect the toxins A and B antigens in stool. There is a rapid test which usually enables us to isolate or to identify the presence of the Clostridioides difficile organism. For this rapid method, we use glutamate dehydrogenase and toxin A and toxin B. Glutamate dehydrogenase is usually present in both toxigenic and non-toxigenic strains. So, if the person is positive for both toxin A and B along with glutamate dehydrogenase, it confirms the presence of Clostridioides difficile. However, if the person has positive only for glutamate dehydrogenase, we can definitely confirm the presence of non-toxigenic strain of this organism. However, a further confirmation by PCR, real-time PCR or gene expert is needed to establish conclusively the presence of this organism. These molecular methods primarily target genes such as TCDA standing for toxin A, TCDB coding for toxin B, and TPI triose phosphate isomerase. As in all the other molecular techniques, they are very highly sensitive and very specific with a faster turnaround time. Usually, those for whom only GDH is positive, we usually recommend for further confirmation with these molecular methods. Colonoscopy can also be done. It is very specific, but compared to the other methods, the sensitivity is quite low. Histopathology can also be done, and the pseudomembrane formation can be demonstrated by doing colonoscopy. Histopathology stain is the HND stain, which is usually employed to detect the pseudomembrane, the presence of pseudomembrane. Again, like colonoscopy, histopathology is also a very highly specific test, but the sensitivity is low. So, the point that you should remember is the rapid antigen detection test should be performed where you detect the toxin and the glutamate dehydrogenase, and depending on the result we can follow up with the molecular test. Please remember that this particular infection is a nosocomial infection. Therefore, we need to employ contact precautions while nursing the patient. The importance of hand hygiene cannot be diluted, and this hand hygiene should be performed with soap and water instead of alcohol hand rub, because alcohols are usually not sporicidal. So whenever we have a patient with a suspected Clostridioides difficile diarrhea, uh, when you screen initially and when you await the lab investigations to come, as you await, okay, you should employ contact precautions to take care of this person, and that too with soap and water. Alternatively, you may also use 4% chlorhexidine hand wash. The person should be ideally isolated, and rigorous environmental disinfection should be ensured, because please remember, the spores are the culprit here. So proper disinfection of the floor, surfaces, toilets and other soiled areas should be done with 1% freshly prepared sodium hypochlorite solution. Please remember that the toilets that are used by such patients should ideally be should not be shared ideally by the others. So, treatment. In mild to moderate cases, we usually prefer oral vancomycin or metronidazole or fidaxomicin for 10 days. In fulminant patients, we prefer oral vancomycin plus IV metronidazole plus rectal vancomycin. And in recurrent cases, it depends on the number of recurrences that the patient has. If there is a first recurrence, then we go for oral vancomycin and fidaxomicin. In case of multiple recurrences, we go for oral vancomycin for 10 days, which can be tapered over 2 to 8 weeks. So give a full dose of oral vancomycin 10 days, followed by tapering of the doses for next 2 to 8 weeks. You may also choose to give IV immunoglobulin, which can neutralize the toxins of Clostridioides difficile. Fecal microbiota transplant has also been successfully employed, where the gut flora is replenished with feces from a screened healthy donor. Fidaxomicin is generally preferred for hypervirulent strains, as I mentioned earlier, and also used in cases of relapse. So this is about Clostridioides difficile. Now let us look at Clostridium botulinum. Clostridium botulinum is a usual cause of a disease called as botulism. Botulus is derived from a Greek word which means sausage, because initially it was thought that this organism is usually acquired by consuming poorly cooked sausages. Apart from causing botulism, which is a food poisoning, it can also cause wound infections and infant botulism. Clostridium botulinum is an anaerobic gram-positive bacilli with subterminal spore. These spores do not secrete toxins, but when they germinate, especially in anaerobic atmosphere, the toxins are produced. Usually in an adult intestine, the germination will not occur, but in the intestine of infants, this can take place. So as I mentioned, it produces subterminal oval bulging spores. If you do a culture, we can identify this organism in blood agar or in Robertson cooked meat broth. In blood agar, they produce large, irregular, semi-transparent colonies which are hemolytic and have a fimbriated border. The growth on the culture media can be confirmed by doing a gram stain, where we can see gram-positive non-capsulated bacilli with subterminal oval bulging spores. These organisms are also motile by peritrichate flagella. in the RCM or Robertson cooked meat broth, they can produce both proteolytic and saccharolytic colonies. It depends on the serotype of the toxins. If the infecting strain belongs to Clostridium botulinum A, B, and F serotype, it usually produces proteolytic colonies. And if the infecting organism serotype belongs to C, D, and E, it can usually produce saccharolytic colonies. Serotyping is usually done with type-specific antisera. Please remember that just presence of bacilli in the food or feces is of less significance. We need to demonstrate the toxin by growing the samples or injecting the samples into the mouse. The samples that are chosen are usually serum, stool, sterile water, or enema, saline enema. Once again I repeat: serum, stool, sterile water, or saline enema, gastric aspirates or wound material, or samples of ingested foods. Usually symptoms develop after 48 hours of injection into the mouse. In mouse, it can cause a flaccid paralysis. This can be inhibited by prior administration of specific antitoxin. Okay, so having mentioned the toxins, it is now very important for all of us to understand the pathogenesis of this infection. As I mentioned, Clostridium botulinum causes the infection botulism, which is a type of food poisoning. Clostridium botulinum is usually non-invasive, and the organism becomes invasive due to the presence of the or due to the production of the powerful neurotoxin which is called as botulinum toxin. Now, botulinum toxin is a 150 kilodalton zinc dependent protein consisting of a heavy chain and a light chain. The serotypes of the botulinum toxin are basically identified by identifying the light chains. There are usually 8 serotypes, and among these serotypes, serotype A, B, and E usually causes human disease. Among these A, B, and E serotypes, serotype A causes the most severe disease. The other serotypes such as C1, C2, D, F, and G produces neurotoxin. Other serotypes like C1, F, and G. C1, F, and G produces neurotoxin, except serotype C2. Serotype C2 produces enterotoxin. Okay, so I repeat: serotype C1 produces neurotoxin while C2 produces enterotoxin. Types C and D are usually coded by bacteriophages. Now, one thing that is very peculiar about botulinum toxin is that it differs. It is an exotoxin, alright, but this exotoxin is produced intracellularly. Okay, this is the unique feature of botulinum toxin. Exotoxin is produced intracellularly, and it appears outside only after the autolysis of the bacterial cell. Initially, it is secreted as a protoxin. This protoxin is usually non-toxic, and this protoxin is activated by proteolytic enzymes and trypsin to convert itself into the active form. So, how does this toxin act? Under the normal circumstances, the acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter, is usually transported within the synaptic vesicles, and this synaptic vesicle usually forms a complex with the neuromuscular junction by a set of proteins which are called as snare proteins. The snare proteins are synaptobrevin, SNAP22, and syntaxin. So this protein complex fuses with that of the synaptic vesicle, whereby the vesicle binds to the neuromuscular junction and releases the acetylcholine. If the person is exposed to botulinum toxin, what happens? This botulinum toxin, which is acquired either through ingestion, through inhalation, or it can be produced in the wound, it is transported via blood to these peripheral cholinergic nerve terminals located in the neuromuscular junctions, postganglionic, parasympathetic nerve endings, and peripheral ganglia. It disrupts the snare protein complex. You can see here the light chain, the botulinum toxin here gets endocytosed, and the light chain of this toxin disrupts the snare protein complex here. Okay, so all these serotypes disrupt the snare protein complex, and this binding which takes place normally, this binding with the synaptic vesicle and the complex doesn't take place here. Okay, so this disruption inhibits the release of acetylcholine, leading to flaccid paralysis. Please keep in mind, there is another species of Clostridium, Clostridium tetani. Clostridium tetani causes spastic paralysis, whereas Clostridium botulinum causes flaccid paralysis. Because it causes flaccid paralysis, sometimes botulinum toxin can also be used to treat conditions such as strabismus, blepharospasm, and myoclonus. Now, what are the different types of botulinum toxin or botulism? So you have foodborne botulism. This foodborne botulism is usually a resultant of consumption of foods which contain preformed botulinum toxin, and as I mentioned, most commonly types A, B, E, F are responsible for the causation of foodborne botulism, and the most common source of this food poisoning is the homemade canned food. So the symptoms that can usually occur are all the resultant features of flaccid paralysis, leading to blockage of acetylcholine in the cranial nerve and parasympathetic nerve terminals. So the common symptoms are your 3 Ds: diplopia, dysphasia, and dysarthria. Okay, I repeat: diplopia, dysphasia, dysarthria, descending symmetric flaccid paralysis of voluntary muscles, reduced deep tendon reflexes, along with constipation. Please keep in mind that there are no sensory or cognitive deficits, and death usually occurs due to respiratory muscle paralysis. Blocking of the acetylcholine release is permanent, but please remember that the action is short lasting, as the recovery occurs in about 2 to 4 months once the new terminal axons are formed. Therefore, therapeutically, this toxin is used in strabismus, blepharospasm, and myoclonus. The other feature is the wound botulism, and wound botulism usually occurs from contamination of wounds with the spores of Clostridium botulinum. This particular wound botulism is usually caused by type A serotype of botulinum toxin. all the features that I mentioned before of foodborne botulism is present except for the gastrointestinal features. Infant botulism is usually seen in less than 6 months of age, and this usually results from the ingestion of contaminated honey or contaminated food with the spores of Clostridium botulinum in children less than 6 months of age. As you all know, breastfeeding is the ideal food for children of lesser than 6 months of age. The child should be ideally breastfed, but sometimes in the Indian traditional practices, just to initiate the breastfeeding, sometimes some of the parents or some of those, especially in the rural areas, they tend to give water mixed with sugar or honey so that the child can initiate the suckling process. But this is absolutely a false practice and should be discouraged at all cost. Okay, because uh, conditions like this can occur, especially if the honey is contaminated. So child will be unable to suck and swallow, the voice will be weakened, there will be ptosis, the neck will be floppy with extreme weakness. So therefore your infant botulism is also sometimes called as the floppy child syndrome. Later on, it progresses to generalized flaccidity, respiratory failure, and sudden death. Please remember that adult intestinal botulism can also occur rarely in those with suppressed normal flora. So, the colonized Clostridium spores in this condition will germinate to produce toxin. The botulism can also be iatrogenic in nature when you inject an overdose of toxin, especially when it is used for therapeutic purposes, like you give Botox injections, especially for anti-aging purposes. So in those situations you will have iatrogenic botulism. Lab diagnosis is primarily done by two methods. One is you can isolate the bacilli and you can demonstrate the toxin. The toxin, both these methods I have mentioned previously. So you can, for repetition, let me just reiterate that the bacilli is isolated, can be isolated in both RCM broth and also in blood agar. In RCM broth, it is proteolytic and saccharolytic, both proteolytic and saccharolytic, depending on the serotype of the organism which is infecting the host. And toxin demonstration can be done by injecting the specimens into the mouse and observing for the flaccid paralysis. So treatment is usually done by procedures such as mechanical ventilation if there is a development of respiratory paralysis. Botulinum antitoxin can be given if there is a clinical suspicion, especially if you have a patient with flaccid paralysis following consumption of canned food. You can definitely give the botulinum antitoxin earlier, because earlier the administration, better is the cure. This antitoxin will neutralize the unbound free toxin molecules. However, please keep in mind that if the toxin gets bound to these nerve endings, then there is no role for the antitoxin. And in the case of wound botulism, these wounds and abscesses has to be thoroughly cleaned, debrided and drained. There is no role for antibiotics as of now for the treatment of this condition. However, this organism is definitely susceptible to penicillin. So this is in a nutshell about Clostridioides difficile and Clostridium botulinum. Thank you for your patient hearing.